to introduce our first speaker. Thank you.
Okay, Nick, where's Nick? He's going to be our first speaker, and he works with NRCS, Ross County, Ladysmith, and he's going to talk about converting cropland to hay and pasture, hay fields and pasture. And I will mention that I know somebody who did a master's degree on this exact topic, and he probably doesn't know anything about that, but we'll talk about that later. So, Nick, carry on.
So, thank you for the introduction. So, yeah, my name is Nick Basacy, and I am a district conservationist with the USDA NRCS. So I run the Ladysmith and Medford field offices. So I actually cover Russ, Sawyer, Taylor, and Price County. It's a little bigger than Rhode Island and slightly smaller than Connecticut. And we got a few staff running around and doing the best we can. So today, Lynn asked me to speak about a topic that is very near and dear to his heart. Let's see here. Let's see if this will work. Try it. Uh-oh. Technical difficulties on the first presentation.
Uh-oh.
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 That is something we don't want to hear.
All right. There you go.
There, oh, can we go back one real quick? So Lynn asked me to talk about a new enterprise he's trying to get off the ground, which is the Hereford Jumping and Barrel Racing League. And in order to do this, I'm going to have Jeremy Zeit come up later and demonstrate how to get a saddle on a Hereford, and we'll go from there. All kidding aside, next. Today I'm going to talk about some cropland conversion and incorporating cropland into a rotational grazing system, both as a permanent pasture type setting, as well as keeping cropland as cropland, but just trying to get cattle out there as part of a cropland rotation. So we think of like corn and bean rotation. What if we had a corn, bean, annual forages that were grazed 1 year rotation, then it goes back into corn and beans. So we're gonna talk about some ways to do that. Then I'm gonna talk, I got some annual forages updates, extending the grazing season, outwintering and infrastructure, and some NRCS program opportunities. So right away, I'd like to start with our pasture and hayland planting. So at NRCS, we assign numbers to everything, so that if you ever hear anyone say, oh, we're gonna do some 512 out on your farm, that's just our way of saying we're gonna plant some grass and clover out there. So inside of our practice standard, we have new seedings versus interseeding versus frost seeding. So a new seeding, it's a row crop field, corn or soybeans or small grains, and we're gonna establish, permanent pasture, a new seeding, or a permanent hay field, and some of the considerations on that. Interseeding is where we already have an existing sward of grass or stand of grass, and we're gonna be introducing some more diversity in there and some ideas on that. And then frost seeding is a very narrow time period and a very narrow band for getting legumes into a pasture. And today would probably be a halfway decent day to go do a little frost seeding after you're done here, if you really wanted to. So we'll talk about that. One thing I'm gonna harp on all the time is soil fertility and requirements. A lot of folks think it's like, oh, it's grass, it'll be fine. I got some cows out there, it'll be fine. There's some, manure and urine going out there, the nutrients will take care of itself. Well, to have a well-functioning pasture, you're gonna need as much nutrients as you would to grow a crop of corn that's gonna yield well. So you have to think about that fertility. Timing for success, so timing of plantings is very important. So up in this area, NRCS is looking at a spring window and a late summer window. And I'm gonna get into a little bit about the differences on those. So spring window is frost comes out May to early June. And then we have another window that opens up end of July into early August. I've actually had some of my most successful pasture and hayland plantings targeting that later window. And there's a couple different Reasons for that, one we all saw last summer was anything you planted, say, end of May, how well did that do last year when it didn't rain for 30 straight days in Rusk County? So, and then the last thing I want to talk about right now is when can I graze? So we've just planted a new pasture. It's greening up. Things are looking really well, and you're like, man, there's a lot of forage out there. When should I put cattle on that? Well, you got to fight the urge for a little bit to put cattle out there right away, or your other livestock, especially some of the other small ruminants like sheep that might actually want to graze down lower, and they have a propensity to like tug on stuff and pull it out. So if there isn't a good root there yet, you can trash your new seeding pretty quick by putting animals on it a little too soon. So if you're working with NRCS or some of the other government agencies, you're going to get seeding recommendations from us. Whether you have caution or not, we can provide those. And you're going to get a sheet that looks like this. That's going to say farm, your name, tract, field numbers. I don't expect you all to read this, but what county it's in, that's important because that's going to tie back to seeding dates, because southern part of the state's a little different seeding dates than the northern part. But we're going to give you grasses and legumes split out, and we're always going to give it to you as pure live seed considerations. That's really important because here it'll say you need 27 pounds per acre, or 5 pounds per acre, 27.5 pounds for this seeding of pure live seed. When you go buy a 50-pound bag of red clover, is there 50 pounds of seed in there? Probably not. So this is a real live example of a seed tag that was brought into my office. Producer bought a 50-pound bag of red clover. There is 65% pure live or pure seed in there. The rest is coating material. Then of that seed that's in there, only 90% of it's going to eventually germinate. So that bag has like high 20s, so about 28, 29 pounds of actual pure live seed in a 50-pound bag of seed. I cannot stress how important it is to look at every bag tag when you buy seed. Because sometimes red clover, it will not be inoculated. And it will be, 90% germination and there's not a lot in there. Your grasses don't actually have a lot of extra inert matter or other stuff. On this seed tag, it'll also say if there's any noxious weeds found. So I've actually stumbled across seed tags that say like 2% noxious weeds. Yeah, maybe we go find a different bag of seed before we plant that in our pasture. So NRCS is also operating off of a percentage mix, and we go by seeds per square foot. So when we plan a mix for you, we're going to require a minimum of 60 seeds per square foot at planting. And for any time we're doing a pasture, we only want no more than half of that to be legume seed. So not by pounds, but by seeds per square foot, and we translate that for you. So one of the risks with grazing legumes, especially if it's wetter in the morning, moist, you could run into some bloat issues. We don't want to set someone up for failure that way. So hayland seedings, we can do a little bit more, a little different stuff. We can use straight alfalfa on those, but there's some other fertility requirements with that. So when we're talking forages and new seedings, we're looking at forage diversity a lot of times, and that's what a lot of graziers want to see, some diversity in their pasture. They don't want just one grass or one legume out there. So we break that down into cool season versus warm season forage, and then your grasses versus your legumes. So cool season grasses, orchard grass, timothy, a lot of the ones we're familiar with. Some of the warm season grasses, big and little blue stem, are out there, switchgrass. Up in this area, there's actually a pretty good yield you can get on some of those grasses, and it can open up a prime time to graze a little later into the summer. Say they hit their vigorous peak in like August, whereas your cool season grasses are hitting their vigorous peak in May, June, and then again in September, October sometimes, depending on the year. And that gets to these forage growth curves. So NRCS has broken down with our partners through the forage suitability groups for each soils type in the state, what's going to grow there and when is it going to produce the most tonnage. So you see your grasses spike in spring and again in fall, and conversely you see your legumes spike, in summer months. So that's another reason to have some diversity on your pasture. The other thing we like to talk about is yield potential and forage quality. So forage quality is a function of fertility as well as yield potential. So whenever you're going to be doing a new seeding, we would like to go back to that fertility because that's your best time to address it before you get that stand going. And then forage quality can even get back to what variety of seeds you pick. And that's where NRCS is going to be a hard stop. I'm not going to recommend what brand of seed or what specific genetics of seed that we want. We just are targeting this species of plant and a certain seeding rate on that. So you're going to have to work with some other places to find those recommendations if there's one variety of, say, orchard grass that might perform better on your farm. And then lastly, just a quick note on companion crops. So when we do new seedings, even on a pasture, like to plant oats or oats and peas with that. It's a good way to get some forage going. It can kind of act as a trainer or a cover for that clover and grass. And it's also a good way to get some forage pretty quick because you can take that, graze it off or harvest off those oats. And it's always in my recommendations to plant a companion crop, especially when you're doing a new seeding. So this goes back to the idea, soil health and fertility. I like to say soil health is not an idea. A lot of times we talk about it like it's this mythical thing that we're chasing that we can't quantify. Well, there's actually soil health testing out there now. We can look at organic matter, we can look at respiration, we can look at the amount of fungi and bacteria in your soil and compare it to other soils that are not under that same management and say which one is healthier. And this gets to that idea of resiliency. The more organic matter you have, the more free nutrients you get every year, and the higher your available water holding capacity is. So it's pretty impressive what you can do by adding a couple percentage of organic matter to your soil. So looking at that goes back to profitability, and on your personal farm where you're managing it, soil health is your responsibility. So in a grazing setting, it's ensuring you're not overgrazing, you're not putting your cattle on the pastures when there's added stress, say from too much moisture or too little moisture. We can talk about ideas like sacrifice paddocks, pulling them off, supplemental feeding, so you're not doing long-term damage to your pasture that's going to impact your soil health down the road. So soil fertility, that's kind of a moving target for some folks, especially if you're not doing soil testing, right? So some cropland farmers, every third year, I recommend you do that on your pastures as well. Once you get a soil test, it says, oh, here's my pH, here's what I have for nutrients, that kind of stuff. Well, what do I do with it? Well, if you want to go dig a little deeper, UW Extension puts out a publication every year, 82809, and it actually has recommendations, and how it does is it breaks it out. So a pasture with greater than or equal to 30% legumes, if you feel like you can get a 4-ton yield average, it's telling you, based on your soil test results of low, high, optimum, whatever it might be, how much actual supplemental nutrient, in this case, potassium and phosphorus, to put on that pasture. So even if you have a good soil test, it's still recommending you do some sort of fertilizer to keep that plant going and active. This chart shows soil pH. This is one of the things that kind of gets overlooked sometimes, especially with new seedings and the legumes most importantly. A lot of our legumes need a pH of like 6 to 6.7, especially alfalfa. So what this chart shows is pH is on the bottom, and it shows nutrient availability based on what the pH is. So as you can see here, the bands, as they get narrow, the nutrient is less available. So nitrogen is less available the more basic or acidic a soil gets. So if you look at about 6.7, almost every nutrient is in the optimal zone. So we're shooting for a slightly acidic soil. ever so slightly. So a lot of you guys, if you don't know what your pH is, go grab some soil tests and get that figured out, because you can get that. Lime's probably the best date for your pastures on, or the cheapest date for adjusting fertility and nutrition for your pasture. So talking a little bit about how we can get this going. So let's say we've addressed our fertility, we know what our pH is, we're ready to go, we have our seed mix. So now we need to make a decision of how we're gonna get that out there. So one of the things that Lynn would like me to talk about today is no-tilling. So who here's got a no-till drill or used one before for new seedings? Okay, so I'm preaching to the choir a little bit, but there's some good advantages. Less soil disturbance, especially on a hilly soil or a hilly field, less chance for erosion, increased available moisture, because when we do that tillage, by not doing the tillage, we're not going to dry out the soil as much. Reduced energy use, because you're not going to be out there disking it or chisel plowing, then disking and all that kind of stuff. And then with the drill, you should be able to get proper seed depth. And I say should be able to get proper seed depth. That's one of the disadvantages, is you need to know how to set that drill up. And if you have a mix of grass and legumes, you need to make sure you have the right kind of equipment to get that seed at the proper mix. Because if I say, hey, let's get 2 pounds of this clover, 2 pounds of that clover, 4 pounds of this grass, and 4 pounds of that grass out on your field, you're gonna get it sometimes in one bag. Hopefully you get it in 2 bags. How are you gonna get that through your drill and out there? And then if you're gonna have a companion crop recommendation like oats, is that whole system set up to get that at that proper seed depth when it's out there? And I'm not an implement dealer, so that's where you go to check out how to set that particular drill up. The other thing we look at is herbicide use. So if you're doing a new seeding in a cropland setting, and let's say you have some Roundup resistant weeds out there, or you just have any type of weeds, thistle, all that kind of stuff could be present, you're gonna have to use herbicide or different types of herbicide to control those weeds, because you're not doing any tillage to control those weeds. So you don't want them to show up in your pasture. So sometimes under a no-till setting, we actually increase our herbicide use. And then under a no-till setting, we're also not able to incorporate our nutrients at depth. So we're broadcasting everything on the surface and then no-tilling in there. So we're not actually getting any of that mixing in the profile. So it can take a little longer to adjust pH, and it can take a little longer to get nutrients down to the root zone. And we're also opening ourselves up for potentially having some of that, say, potash or urea leaving the field in a couple of different ways. Like that urea is then exposed to the air, so it can volatilize, or if you catch the wrong rain the day after you apply, even manure, it could end up down in the creek somewhere, and we wouldn't want that. So some considerations to think about with no-till. So on the interseeding side, using like a no-till planter into an existing pasture. Has anyone here ever tried that before? A few hands. So does it always work out really great and you get to see all the seed show up, right? It can be really tough. It can be really tough. So we consider interseeding. You can do both grasses or legumes, but this is kind of the most important part, the site prep and existing stand composition. So if you're going into an existing pasture and you got your drill out there, you need to do some sort of site prep. And that site prep could be mowing or haying it really tight. I actually talked to one producer who it was late in the season and they burned their pasture and then no-tilled, and that one actually worked out pretty good, really well. But you gotta be set up for burning, and not everyone wants to go around with a drip torch and light their pasture on fire. That can be a little bit of an uneasy feeling. So definitely talk with your NRCS office or somebody before you start lighting everything on fire. Another thing is, like I already mentioned, like how dangerous overgrazing can be. But if you're gonna overgraze for a specific purpose, to get that thatch layer down, not have a lot of cover, so you can specifically no-till in there, that actually might be a technique that you could use. Because you can't drag that drill through, 2 feet of active growing pasture and expect it to work out. So again, drill setup. Some people, their gut might run to, oh, if I'm drilling into an existing pasture, I want to have a very aggressive setup for row cleaners and that kind of stuff. I found just the opposite sometimes can be really effective, is just taking all that front stuff off and you're just making that little slit and dropping the seed in there with the opener. Instead of trying to actually move stuff out of the way, it can be a more effective technique when you're interseeding. And then the last note is existing stand competition. If you're going to try and interseed, say, into a stand of like smooth brome, a sod forming grass, and it's already really tight, you're gonna have some struggles, especially if you don't do some really aggressive site prep to try and like intentionally knock that brome back, because that's gonna be so aggressive and fight the other stuff that you just planted there. So no-till planting after outwintering. So anybody do outwintering of cattle, like bale grazing, that kind of stuff? Oh, good, excellent. So when you guys are done outwintering, like to take that soil test, see how much nutrients we have there, because you've probably had a lot of cows there for a while. Then we got to do something with that residue, right? If you're just going to drag a no-till drill across a field that was just outwintered on, you're going to have some areas that have really good catch, and then you're going to have some of those areas where maybe there's a lot of thatch left. I don't want to call it waste because that's good carbon for your soil, but we're going to have to do something with it. So you can do a couple of things, you know. What are you gonna do with that residue? Leave it alone, not try and interseed, see what comes back. That can be successful sometimes. However, a lot of folks will go in and broadcast seed over the surface. Again, that can be successful sometimes. Disc and interseed, that can be a really good technique to smooth that out. How aggressive are you setting that disc up? And then rake and no-till, and that's kind of the one I want to talk about today. So there's a lot of different rakes or different type of implements out there that you can use to spread that residue around so you don't have those spots where it's like a blanket. And then fire up that no-till drill and drag it across those spots. So, and then kind of what to plant. Some folks will just go with their normal pasture mix right away after outwintering. One of the new kind of emerging fronts is annual forages. So instead of planting your pasture mix right back on a spot you outwintered, think about that spring planting a mix of annual forages. So something that could have everything from radishes to turnips to sunflowers to sorghum Sudan grass, that kind of stuff in it, oats and peas. You can get a lot of tonnage that you can graze multiple times and then come back late summer, say in early August, and plant your annual mix on that. And then plant your permanent pasture mix there. So instead of having to wait for forage to show back up on that outwinter area, you're gonna get some pretty instant results with the annual forages. You can probably graze it 2-3 times that summer with the annual forage there, then plant your pasture mix and stay off of that spot through the fall and winter. And it should be ready to go the next spring. Because we definitely want to rotate our outwinter areas where we're pre-placing those bales, not the same spot back to back to back to back. So NRCS does offer some programs to help with this. We have 2 programs that are kind of the pilot ones that we use for helping people with setting up grazing systems or modifying existing ones. Equip is the kind of the Cadillac. We set up initial rotational grazing systems. We can get you grazing plans, whether written out of our office. I know there's a couple TSPs in the room, so technical service providers that we work with that can also write grazing plans for folks. And then from there, once we have that grazing plan, we can help implement everything from fence to seeding to waterers to actually giving you rotational grazing payments. And then the stewardship program, this one's a little bit more, its primary focus is helping people who already are grazing. So you've already got that infrastructure, you're grazing. There's lots of enhancements, we call them, for trying new things, and we're gonna pay you to do that. And this year, the payments just keep going up. So talk to your NRCS office if you haven't already, and if you think the stewardship program might be good for you. You're not going to get charged a fee to apply to the program. Schedule a time, go talk with your district conservationist. We have offices in Balsam Lake, Spooner, Ashland, Barron, Menominee and Dunn County, Ladysmith, Medford, Chippewa Falls. You're not that far away from an office and having a polite conversation with someone about some of these programs. I'm gonna yield like 2 minutes right now. I'm throwing a curveball to you, Lynn. I'm gonna have someone from FSA, either Sarah or Stuart, come up and just give a 2-minute plug on some of their loan opportunities, because some of this stuff costs a lot of money to get installed. So there is some beginning farmer and micro loan opportunities. Either you wanna take a quick minute on that kind of stuff. So you can apply to our programs and still see FSA for some of these cost share opportunities.
Good morning, my name is Sarah McDonald. I'm the County Executive Director at the Farm Service Agency. I cover Washburn and Burnett counties as well as Barron and Polk counties. We have a couple programs that I think you might all be interested in, and then I'll let Stuart here introduce himself and he can tell you a little bit about some of the loan opportunities. So just really quickly, and thank you for giving us a couple minutes. We have a couple programs. One of them is our livestock forage program. You may have heard a little bit about that this year. It was a popular one, also known as the LFP program. And what that program does is provide producers with compensation when they have pasture or grazing losses. So obviously the last couple years, especially this year, it's been very dry. When we do experience a drought like we did this year, that program kicks in. So it was dry last year. Unfortunately, we have to meet some requirements before that program becomes available. So according to the U.S. Drought Monitor, when we do have a D2 drought for at least 8 consecutive weeks, or a D3 or greater drought for at least 1 day, that's when those LFP benefits kick in, like they did this year. So there are some obviously eligibility requirements that have to be met in order to be eligible for that program, but it is out there. We issued a lot of payments to local producers this year under that program, so just something to consider in the future. Another one is our NAP, or our Non-Insured Crop Disaster Assistance Program. That is similar to crop insurance in that it provides coverage to crops that you can't cover through your traditional crop insurance agency. So your forages and your pasture grounds. Some particular grasses aren't eligible, so you'd have to be sure to check with us to determine what is eligible. And the deadline to enroll for that coverage for your forage and grazing acres is September 30th of each year. So we've already passed the deadline for 2024 coverage, but again, something to consider for 2025. And then the last program I have is our Livestock Indemnity Program, otherwise referred to as the LIP program, and that is for livestock losses due to a qualifying disaster event. So we see those frequently in the spring, during calving season. Maybe there's a weird winter storm that comes up, or the weather changes during calving and you lose some animals. That program could potentially pay for those animal losses if you've already met your normal mortality losses for the year, and we do have some particular requirements and rates to determine that. So again, just some programs that we do have available. If any of those you want to learn more about, I do have some fact sheets over at the table. I have a business card. Feel free to reach out to me via email or at the local office here. But some programs we have for you, so I'll pass it over to Stuart.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Stuart Bartz. As previously mentioned, I'm a loan officer that covers Polk County, working primarily through the Barron office, and I'll just give you a quick 30,000 foot view of the loan programs we have. Essentially, we have 3 programs. We have a loan for land, a loan for equipment, and then a loan for equipment or livestock, and then a loan for inputs. So something where our loan program works really nice with EQIP. EQIP is more of a reimbursement type program. So, they're gonna give you $8,000 to put fencing in, but you don't have $8,000 in the bank. We could potentially look at giving you a short-term loan to buy that material, and then once it's installed, NRCS will reimburse you, you reimburse us, and then everybody walks away happy.
Cool. Thank you guys very much. So we're all going to be here the rest of the day. So if you got any specific questions, please track us down. So I want to talk a little bit more about this idea of grazing cropland. So this isn't going to be permanently converting a crop field to pasture. It's going to be using that crop field to grow annual forages for a year or two and then graze it, pull your animals off, it goes back into a cropland. So there's going to have to be, it's either got to be attached or you got to be able to get animals there. But NRCS is getting into setting up fencing and water even on these sites. And it's kind of a new thing that we just started offering this year. So hopefully a few people's wheels start turning. So if you're managing cropland and pasture, this can be a great way to get livestock manure on that field in kind of like a bioactive form where it isn't stored in a pit under anaerobic conditions for a long time. Not all manure is equal. So we can really greatly increase the biological activity in our soil, and we can also get our carbon to nitrogen ratios better in line with where they should be into a more natural condition by having animals out there for a little bit and growing that annual forage. Some other benefits is we're going to increase that soil health because we put a lot more diversity out there on that field. We can diversify our crop rotation, which should help us break our pest cycles. So again, I'm not an agronomist, but I have just enough knowledge there to be dangerous. So if you're on a corn bean rotation, you can get some different insects and different pest issues and disease issues that come in with that type of rotation. By putting in annual forages for a year or two and grazing it, we can just throw that whole cycle way off kilter and then go back to your corn and beans for a couple years. So it can be very, very high yielding. Some trials have showed we can, with these annual forages with proper fertility, we can do 1.5 to 2 times the tonnage on those acres than you can on your actual traditional pasture with some of the varieties of stuff that's out there. So this can reduce our winter feed, especially if we're planning to graze that later. So in a system like this, we could have an annual forage that's planted, you hay it once, or chop it as a forage once and put it in bags. Then you let that regrow, and then when your pasture is shutting down, you have this 20-acre field over here that has significant tonnage out there that's ready to be grazed. And we can go get that into October, November, even December, before we have to even start feeding our stored feed. So there can be some really good benefits to that. And like I said here, we're not changing that land use from cropland to permanent pasture, and we're actually cost sharing to help you do that. So looking at that, I'd be remiss if I didn't say there are some challenges to this cropland side of things, right? A lot of cropland doesn't have fence. A lot of cropland might not have any sort of water out there. NRCS can help, and we're coming up with ways to cost share fencing, temporary fencing, semi-permanent fencing, movable water lines, that kind of stuff to facilitate grazing out there. So we'll have some ideas there for you on that, and even cost sharing some pretty good movable paddock fencing, so you don't have to just have a perimeter fence, let your animals onto a 20-acre field without being able to break it up a little bit. Obviously, this is going to take some work on your parts, but I think it's something that could be a really good way to kind of take the pressure off your pastures at different times of year, as well as help your cropland fields. So one of the other things on these cropland fields, depending on what the herbicide regime might be, you need to look at carryover. So you can't just make this be a hair trigger decision in May, especially if you have already applied a herbicide that has some carryover, because you're going to plant some seed and wonder where it went. And well, your herbicide carryover got it. So then there's this idea of grazing cover crops. That's a little more narrow. That's, your corn silage comes off, you plant winter cereal rye, you might have an opportunity to graze that the next spring before you plant your next commercial crop. That's kind of just an ancillary benefit of cover crops. I'm talking this is like dedicated field for a whole year to grow forage. And then with some of these annual forages, we can get some prussic acid and nitrate toxicity depending on how low we graze things and timing. So depending on what you've planted and when you planted it, definitely work with NRCS because there are some very narrow bands when some of these annual forages could be mildly toxic to your cattle. And then, of course, if you're even on a cropland field, if it's too wet to have animals out there, you could lead to some significant compaction because you probably in that cropland setting might not have the same soil structure. It might be what we call a little more massive soil, so it's going to be really susceptible to compaction from animals if we're not careful. So a couple other things on the emerging front. This is more if you've already got a pasture set up. We're actually paying people to defer grazing or leave refuge areas for grassland birds. So if you have a system already and you're not at like a carrying capacity with your animal numbers, we can pay you to, instead of maybe haying that section right away like you normally would, actually defer grazing for a month to leave nesting habitat for grassland birds. And here I got a picture of a bobolink and everyone's favorite sharp-tailed grouse, which we still have a few of in this area of Wisconsin. So another idea here for extending your grazing season, which we can pay for through several of our programs, is especially CSP as an enhancement, is stockpiling forages. So when we stockpile forages, this isn't row crop gleaning. What we're doing is we have our pasture. Coming late summer, we're going to intentionally not graze a section of our pasture and let it get significant regrowth. So we're deferring grazing, just say like in the month of August and September, skipping a rotation, and then coming back to it in October or November, so we don't have to start bale grazing. Anytime that we don't have to put up feed and store feed, it can be really good. It can be really good for the pocketbook. The other thing here is the potential on cropland. We could stockpile some forages, especially if you already have a small grain in rotation. You could say that gets harvested end of July, first week of August. If you have the ability to get animals on that field, you could plant a forage out there that's not a cover crop, but specifically meant for you to go graze it come October, November, December, and that's gonna be a little different mix than a cover crop, and it needs to be in the ground by early August, so that's not gonna work with every crop. You can't do that with corn and beans because you just can't get in there at the densities we need to actually grow meaningful forage under that kind of crop canopy. So of course, another thing that NRCS recommends is bale grazing. It can be a great way to add fertility to your soil. You can find those spots with low fertility, target that with your bale grazing. You can, it's a great way to keep animal health going so they're not sitting on a concrete lot all winter. Like I said before, I've started recommending to my producers to incorporate annual forages after you bale graze those sites instead of just seeding it back to your normal pasture mix right away. Planning ahead. So one technique for bale grazing is to get out there and pre-place those bales. For the folks that said they do outwintering and bale grazing, how many of you guys pre-place a good number of your bales like in October or November? Yeah, it can be really good. Otherwise, you're gonna be fighting the snow and that kind of stuff, or this year's eternal mud season to get your forage out to those outwintering areas. It's not without some challenges, like we said, managing those residues into next spring. See here, there's a couple of spots where you can see where we don't have forage coming back exactly where those bales were placed the year before. So, and on this site, you can see here where I think the site was actually already dragged after some of the bales had been done. So that residue is even being spread already. So some of the infrastructure to help with the outwintering, permanent waterers, lots and that kind of stuff. So there's a cow there, or maybe a steer, not sure, standing by a frost-free water that has a cement apron around it. So it's a high use area, so we can cost share the concrete around it and the frost-free water. Don't worry, NRCS will pay to dig a deep buried pipeline way out onto that pasture and get it away from some of the buildings, because this is also you can use this kind of help with your fertility by not having all your concentration areas right next to a building. It's nice to push that out onto the pasture. There's some site considerations. We don't want to put this in a concentrated flow channel or down in like a wetland area. Those are sensitive areas because there's gonna be some manure concentrated around these sites. So we don't want the spring flush to come and carry all that manure right down into Shell Lake or something like that. So there's also a cost analysis. Even with cost share, that's still cement, that's still a deep buried pipeline. Those waters sitting over there aren't free. So it's gonna probably result in some money out of pocket, and you're gonna have to think about that, especially for some of these practices. NRCS is starting to construct mud season and calving lots where you don't need a CNMP because it's not considered manure storage. And we're having them be there where we limit the amount of cattle on there for up to 45 days to help get you guys through mud season. These are expensive practices. We can do lots, and we can even do covered lots. That's expensive. If you've got 30 cattle, and we're gonna do this, and it's gonna cost you out of pocket, or it's gonna cost 70 grand to do something like this with just a lot or something with a roof on it, it's gonna hang a 6-figure price tag on it. Even if we're paying for 70% of it, that's still a lot of money to come up with just to get you 45 days of concrete. So it's not no, it's not never, but I'm really sitting down with my producers to talk about, does this make sense for your operation? Because the last thing I wanna do is be there helping you and then bankrupt you all at the same time. So really think about this, but it is a tool in the toolbox, so I do like to mention it. NRCS is also starting to move into shade structures and windbreak structures on pastures. That's kind of a new emerging front for us. Typically, we said those are good things. Cattle don't always necessarily need them, but for animal health, especially if you're trying to finish beef on grass, this could be very important to keep that animal stress down. And NRCS is now emerging into cost-sharing shade structures and windbreak structures in a rotational grazing setting. Then we also have animal trails and walkways. Really important for the dairy farms where we're moving animals every day back and forth from pasture to the barn. I'm starting to cost share these a little bit more inside of my grazing, beef grazing plans as well, especially when we have a permanent waterer and we want to rotate those winter bale grazing areas around. There can still be some significant animal traffic, so having even one lane that's improved like this might be highly beneficial. 5 years ago, I would have told you if you're a beef farmer, you don't need it. You don't need it. I've changed on that 100%, and if it's something you want to talk about, I'll definitely entertain sitting down and talking to doing improved lanes even for beef operations. So kind of my last slide here. Just want to say how powerful grass is. Like it just is so good for the environment. It keeps you guys in an agricultural setting. We can manage it. You're providing food to the masses, and it's still agriculture. So I just want to see more grass on the landscape, and I push grazing in my local field offices pretty heavily, in addition to all the other stuff we do, the soil erosion control, the woods work, the wildlife work, any of that kind of stuff. Grazing actually helps solve a lot of those issues by having stuff in permanent grass and legumes that's well managed. So really think about your fertility and your nutrient management. Feed your animals the highest quality feed all the time, and integrate these different practices. Try new things. It's not the end of the world to try something one year, even if it doesn't work out. And sometimes NRCS will be there to help cost share that, to take the anxiety or the edge of that risk off. And then one thing real quick that I wanted to mention, when we're no-tilling into existing pasture, or especially when we're like, say, no-tilling into a soybean field that we're converting to grazing, it can take a hot minute for that to actually fill in. I've seen even a year or two down the road where after you come through and hay that field, or even after you come through and graze it, you can still pick out those rows on the 7.5 inches with the densest forage. I promise it will fill in eventually, but that's one of the things with no-till that you just gotta be ready for. So sometimes I've even had a few producers no-till, and then the next year they follow up with like a light broadcast seeding over the top of that to help that thing fill in there. So I do have a few minutes for questions, I think, Lynn. I didn't burn through my whole time, so if you got any questions, hit hit me with them now. Otherwise, I'll be here till the end of the day. So thank you guys so much. Yeah.
Your fall seeding, are you no-till or frost seeding? Because I've no-tilled in the spring, and I think it's because of the drought situation, I've had poor results all the time. So what do you do in the fall with this seeding?
So the question is kind of when you're doing a late summer seeding, do you recommend no-till or like a broadcast type seeding? I think that fall or the late summer seeding window is probably one of the best times to try no-till because you still have a significant amount of growing season left and it should allow the seed to come up, and you're also going to be planting it at depth, right? So it's gonna not be sitting on the soil surface when it could be a droughty time of year. Even getting that seed an inch or two down there, there's gonna be a little bit more moisture, it's gonna be protected. The other thing that can happen in late fall and summer is sometimes you can have slug issues depending on what the residue is. So if you're seeding out there and you have some insect issues in that field, if it's just laying on the surface, I've seen slugs come in and eat the germ off of every single cereal rye seed that we tried to plant as a cover crop in a field. So one of the things for that late summer seeding, that needs to be done by mid-August. Otherwise, if you say plant that early September, you're really rolling the dice on those plants coming out, and when they're the most fragile, catching a pretty hard frost, and you just threw away a whole bunch of money on that seeding. So I recommend no-till seeding probably by August 20th for these parts as a great way to try and get some forages established. Yeah.
Any recommendations on bale grazing during the year where there's like a lot of freeze thaw like this year? Should it be avoided altogether or just move them really quick?
So the question was outwinter bale grazing on a year this year where there's a lot of freeze thaw. One of the techniques I've seen this year that's been really helpful is producers, since you have access to your pastures, is I've seen some producers intentionally unroll a couple bales along where the actual primary stuff is set up, especially if you can be responsive and see like, well, it's cold today. I know they're gonna go through these next 3 bales in the next week, but it's gonna be in the 50s. If you have an extra bale somewhere, go grab it, unroll it there. Yes, you're gonna have a little more residue to deal with the next year, but you shouldn't pug that area up. And especially true if you're also calving right now, because no one wants to see, calving happening on, mud, at least in my experience. So that's one technique that I've seen. Even in a year like this, I would still try and keep my animals on pasture as much as I possibly could. And maybe even the idea might be to push as much, spread it out a little more on a year like this. I would actually probably go the other way, tighten it up, and actually unroll some bales, because you could probably do more significant long-term damage by trying to spread it out. It might be the year to tighten that grid up and actually put some residue down there for them to use as bedding. But that's just my idea off the cuff here. So any other questions? Like I said, I'll be here the rest of the day, and I just want to thank Lynn for letting me come and talk, and Otto and everyone. So thank you very much.
So is Dr. Jordy here?